In his book, Sex Is as Sex Does, Paisley Curra points out how gender labels are a tool used by the government for oppression. So on page 13, he says, if we decide in advance what male, female, and X, non binary, mean before turning to the empirical situation, regardless of whether we imagine sex as referring to gender identity or to the sex assigned at birth or to current genital configurations, it becomes harder to concentrate on why distinct state actors define sex differently and to figure out what those differences make possible. And state actor is just any person or entity or party acting for the government. So when Curra says what these differences make possible, he is referring to the ways in which state agencies or actors are able to negatively impact non-binary and trans people using gender identity. Curra also points out how the bureaucracy of American government uses sex to inform how they regulate people. However, our system isn't really built to serve people that fall outside of the gender binary. This is the same issue as what the ERA is about. So groups without laws that expressly protect them become marginalized. And trans and non-binary people, because of this lapse, are essentially at the mercy of different state agencies, all with varying agendas and varying understanding of gender. Curra cites the incongruent levels of ease with which state agents allow, or sometimes don't allow, sex reclassification as an expression of the different ways, the different work sex does in different contexts, which put a pin in that thought because I'll flesh it out after this next quote. It's a little bit big picture. Okay, so what do these incongruencies look like? Trans and non-binary people will receive a medley of sex labels on all their various government forms. So their drivers might contradict what it says on their marriage license, might contradict what it says on their passport, So then what we're left with is the question, if sex labels aren't solely for the purpose of reflecting personal identity, the sex labels on, as far as the government's concerned, what are they for? What is it being used for? So Curra goes on to say on page 15, we need to understand at a much more historical and granular level what states are, what they do, and the effects of particular rules, laws, and policies on sex. Rather than being a minor matter of housekeeping, an agency's rule for sex reclassification might be more deeply implicated in the agency's specific governance project than is immediately obvious. And failing to apprehend how a state actor's rules for deciding who is M and who is F further its work. So, even though sex reclassification is a very important gender-affirming practice, it is still just filing trans people within an oppressive system. It's just now they're being filed better. And transphobia is baked into state processes because trans people aren't protected from having their sex used as a sort of wild card by state actors. So back to the thought I put a pin in a while ago, sex doing different work in different contexts. Curra uses the example, and this is later in the book, of how his driver's license says M, male, which he reasons that if an F was on the identity documents of a balding, bearded man such as himself, it would make it more difficult for the state to track and police him. And in this case, in this context, sex is serving as a visual identifier. However, in matters of ownership and distribution of property, such as marriage, which he brings up, the lines of who is male and who is female gets a lot more disjointed. But actually, going through the separate case studies, Curra was able to draw one line of logic. The separate instances in which transgender marriage is and isn't validated, and when trans people are and aren't entitled to custody or compensation, only follow one line of logic, and that is that the disenfranchisement of trans people only happened when their sex didn't serve the non-trans party's interests. So effectively, because trans and non-binary people exist outside of the binary that the government uses to dole out oppression, separate state entities or actors are able to treat trans people's sex as a wild card for whichever purpose they so choose. So with all this, Kerr is really just thinking critically about why the state cares about gender and what our sex is actually being used for. And for my questions, number one, how does Kerr's argument serve to fight against transphobia? And number two, how do the daily issues trans people face with American bureaucracy illuminate the deeper structural flaws in our government? Thank you.